Okay, now I want to talk about the difference between a couple of terms. There's a Celtic term, San Grail, and San Graal, and then there's Sang Real. The Holy Grail, San means holy or saint or something like that. And so when we talk about the Holy Graal, the Graal is, as I said, a German word that means a progressive, going from, it's like the Lam Rim of the Tibetans. It's going from advancement to advancement to advancement, initiation to initiation. It's moving in an upward spiral through various kinds of education, advancement, and gaining of more skills. And that's what the Grail was originally. But in the Christian terms, after the time of Charlemagne, it becomes the Grail legends, and the Grail becomes first a progressive meal, because that is one term that is sometimes used, and then it becomes the cup. It becomes the cup of the Last Supper and all that kind of stuff. So you will see the terms San Graal and San Grial and Sang Real, and they're confused a lot during the Middle Ages, etc., because it's really a transition from these pre-medieval, pre-Catholic times to the Catholic times. So what we're going to do is look at that transition that leads to the development of the legends of the Holy Grail in the West.
Isn't there something about blood?
Yes. Real is, Sung is blood, and Sang Real is blood of the king.
Oh.
Like, Camino Real is the highway of the king. But it's not Real at all. It's Graal, and it's sometimes San Graal, which is the progressive meal, and then it becomes Sang Real, which is the blood of the king, and that's the Eucharistic thing. Anyway, we'll go through all this, so I just want to see, this is what's coming up. We have to talk, we're going to start with Constantine. So, Constantine is one of many generals who's in competition to become the head of what remains of the Roman Empire. Just like back in the days when Pompey and Augustus Caesar and other people were kind of fighting over the Roman Empire. Now we're talking about a time when Rome has been invaded and is being invaded by the Goths, who have been for centuries fought by the Roman soldiers, who have had strongholds up in Gaul, which is France, and the Celtic areas, etc. But now these people have figured out how to fight the Romans and how to beat them. And so they're moving in and they're taking over Rome, and these people are being kind of driven back east. And so the Roman Empire is going to reestablish itself in Turkey, at what today is called Istanbul, but was once Constantinople. Istanbul was Constantinople, you know that thing. Okay, so, Constantine is one of several generals who has big armies. He's one of several gangs that's out there that's kind of fighting for the powers, etc. And he is the person who prevails. And these are some of the symbols of Constantine. He's considered to be very holy and very great by the Christian church.
That's one of the symbols that is still used to this day.
To this day, yeah.
Cairo symbol.
Yeah, the Cairo, which is the first two letters of the word Christ. But it also represents other things. It represented also a militant Christian soldier and a bunch of things like that in the past. It's on the banner. But Constantine, there were many religions in the Roman Empire, and the main ones were Nicene religion and Mithraic religion at that time. And Christianity was one of several small cults. It was not organized. There was no Christian church. There's no monolithic church there. This is now, we're talking about the 300s of the Christian era, the 4th century. And at this time, the many different churches also had many different versions of their Bible. They had, some of them had, most of the stuff that is in our Bible was held by, some of it was in all the different churches. but there was a lot of other stuff, because it's a lot of stuff to put in a Bible, you know, the New Testament we're talking about. The earliest Christians, Jesus and Messianic Christians, their Bible consisted also of what we call the Apocrypha, the intertestamental literature. And then of the early Gentile Christian churches, it consisted of letters and epistles written by people that are not in the New Testament today, like Clement and Ignatius of Antioch. I mentioned some of those, and the Shepherd of Hermes, and many other kinds of things, which you can find, and they're really interesting things to read and study. They're called sub-apostolic fathers and things like this. But there was no unified church, Christian church. Well, Constantine, according to legend, when he was embattled with many different people and so on, be a little careful not to knock that if you could, he saw a vision in the sky of a cross. Now, we don't know what kind of a cross it was. It's just the Greek word staros. It could have been an equal-sided cross, could have been many things. And he saw the words emblazoned across the sky, "In this sign, conquer." And so he asked people, well, what is this sign? What are the symbol? What religion is this a symbol? And they said, I had to look through and figure it all out. Oh, it's this weird little cult called Christianity. And he said, okay, well, go get some of these Christianity people, bring them to me, because their God is going to help me win this battle, according to my vision. So, and if it really works, if this God helps me, then I will make that the religion of the realm. So, in hoc signo vinces, in this sign, conquer, Constantine conquered and became victorious. And so he made Christianity the religion of the realm. The great center of all Christianity would be St. Sophia Cathedral in the new city that he built called Constantine. Became the head of the main central place of the Byzantine Empire, or the Holy Roman Empire as it was called, holy because it became Christian. Now, the message went out. Here's a little image showing, it's an allegorical painting showing Constantine seeing a cross up in the sky and a thing saying, "In the sign conquer," and so on. This is the story anyway. But he decided that he was a little bit unhappy. He was a little perturbed with what he found out about the Christian religion, because they all had different beliefs and they had different books and things like this. So he said he wanted to have one book, one Bible, and he wanted to have one religion, one doctrine. Everything had to be unified. So he called together what were called ecumenical councils. Ecumenical means that the oikumene is the whole world. If something's ecumenical, so the whole bunch of people come together. And their councils in order to straighten all their stuff out and decide what's going to be their Bible, etc. Now, the oldest version of the Bible that we have as the New Testament and Old Testament we have as a Christian, quote, Bible, is the Byzantine version. And that version of the Bible is the least accurate. It just takes all kinds of things and cuts and scissors and pastes them together. So, for example, the original Gospel of Luke is about 1/3 as long as it is in the Byzantine Bible, because those were things that were added on. Because the scribes copied things down, they either added things in they had heard, or legends, or somebody had done this, etc. So we don't really have the most original stuff. It's really the most corrupt text that we can possibly have, is the Byzantine version. And that was the version that was used by St. Jerome to translate it into the Latin Vulgate, which became the basic Bible of Roman Catholicism. But anyway, he brought all these people together and wanted to do this and decide which books would be part of the canon, which would not, and all this sort of thing, and what their doctrines would be. And out of those came these ecumenical councils. And in the ecumenical councils is where the proto-Orthodox fundamentalists triumphed, where they declared that Origen, one of the greatest mystical Christian thinkers, Origen of Alexandria, was a heretic or was wrong, and so his writings wouldn't be accepted. think we're going to get a lot of flies in here, sweetie, if you keep that door open. We're already getting, yeah. And it was where it was also decided Athanasius and other people had really come down on Bishop Arius. Arius we'll look at in a minute, and that's where they declared that he was heretical, and that's where a whole lot of things about Christian doctrine were decided. You might remember Jesus didn't go around telling people that they had to confess their sins and they were evil. He did almost the opposite of that. He didn't go around telling them they had to believe things or they'd go to hell and all this kind of stuff, you know. But this is what Christianity became. It became a doctrinally creedal-based thing. So the Nicene Creed is the most famous of these creeds we know. There's the Apostles' Creed and a whole lot of other things. But basically, the creeds were agreed upon by the people who had the best relationships with Constantine and his superiors. They were basically decided not by a council of philosophers and wise men. They were decided by a bunch of politicians in a smoke-filled room with a bunch of cigars and harlots in the back rooms or something. You know, it's sort of like the Democratic National Party. I mean, I donate to the Democratic Party, but you know, it's how politics gets done. It was a political thing. It was not really high spiritual activity. And so the compromises were made out of which Byzantine Christianity evolved. Now, the city of Constantine, the Byzantine Empire, Constantinople, grew and became very powerful in the east, not in the west, though, because Rome was kind of left to hang out for itself, hang out to dry. And it became known as the Holy Roman Empire, because it was still Roman. It was ruled by Romans and Roman ideas, and people spoke Latin and all this sort of thing. We know it as Byzantium, the Byzantine Empire. And I mentioned St. Sophia as being the main cathedral of the head of the Byzantine Church. Now, at those times, there were bishops. Bishops in all kinds of places. The bishops were the highest officials. They're like the generals. And bishops only could ordain people and raise people up, etc. Priests and deacons and other minor orders were all functioning as part of the apostolic authority that a bishop had. But the bishops acted collegially. That is, they acted in collegium together in a synod, and whatever they agreed upon in a synod was considered to be inspired by God. So they didn't rely upon Bibles. The Bible didn't become a big deal until about the 14th century with Protestantism, because Protestantism did not have an apostolic succession that they could claim. So Protestants had to go back to the Bible and make that their main authority instead of bishops. But bishops were the main authority, and what they decided in a group was what happened. And as we can see, it doesn't work very well with bishops making decisions or Bibles making decisions anyway. But this is what happened. The Byzantine Church developed, and the head of that, St. Sophia, was a place where the main bishops, who were the ones that served in Constantinople, existed. Now in Rome, in those days, in Greek, the name of all the bishops were called papas, popes. So every bishop was a pope back then. But in Rome, they were pretty isolated. They kind of developed by themselves. So that bishop there, the head bishop there, was called the papa, and eventually known as the pope. And that developed outside of the realm of the Holy Roman Empire. And because when the invading Visigoths and Ostrogoths and all the Goths left, the bishop or pope of Rome took over the city and rebuilt it with all of his monks, and it turned it into just totally a Christian monastic city, and they rebuilt the aqueducts, etc. And then they sent out missionaries and things. But already before they could send out any missionaries, many missionaries had gone out centuries before. They had been sent out by people like St. Arius and so on, who had evangelized these things. In fact, we know that Christianity, the Christian church, Celtic church, was existing in the 1st century in England. And because we know historically that some of the captives the Roman soldiers brought over were Christian kings that came over from the British Isles and things like that. But it was a different kind of Christianity. It was not Roman Christianity. It was certainly not Byzantine. It was a Christianity that combined with a very shamanic kind of religion known as Druidism. And the Byzantine Empire was able to legislate out of existence anything that was not coherent with its religious ideas and its doctrines, except for the Johannite Church, or churches. They had been established by Mary Magdalene and by the Apostle John. And they existed without the advantages of having an association with the state. Essentially what happened in the Byzantine Empire is the state became the church. And, or some people say the church became the state. That's not true. There was no church. There was a state. The churches got affiliated and they got sucked up to the state, just like the Roman Catholic Church did with the nobility of Europe. And when the French Revolution came, it wasn't just the nobility was overthrown, the Catholic Church was overthrown, and its authority, its power, and the Inquisition basically came to a grinding halt in the power of the Catholic Church, because it was allied with those people. Well, in the Byzantine Empire, the ruling class of people, the reason we call clergy is because they're clerics, they're bureaucrats that work for the state. And then that was the time where the state was the church. And so, if you were not a member of the state church, and you were part of this more Johannite Christian thing, you weren't persecuted, you weren't executed, but you didn't make advancement socially. You didn't get the higher offices in society. You didn't get the jobs and the different kind of advantages that came with association with the state.
But there was an association, huh? They were.
The church and the state were one item, one thing.
But I mean the Johannite churches, I thought they went to Asia.
No, not Asia Minor. Asia Minor is where we're talking about Turkey and that area, okay? So that's where Constantinople was in the Byzantine Empire. So the Johannite churches existed kind of independently. And it's out of them, as I said before, that the Egyptian desert monasticism developed. And if you read The Wisdom of the Desert by Thomas Merton, there's a wonderful book. It's a very short version of this massive amount of literature, spiritual literature, that evolved out of these spiritual movements that were not part of really the Byzantine Empire at that time. The Philokalia is a big, huge collection of the sayings and stories of the Desert Fathers. And you can get this online in different kinds of places. And it became eventually part of Eastern Orthodoxy, the monastic tradition, the spiritual traditions, because there's great spiritual philosophers among the Eastern Orthodox. If you go to Eastern Orthodox seminary, you don't study biblical studies. You don't study a lot of most of the things that you would study in a Protestant seminary or even a Catholic seminary. But what you do is you read Gregory of Nyssa and all the great mystics in their Neoplatonic Christian philosophy, and that's what you really study in the Eastern Orthodox Church. So after the Arab conquest, Constantinople becomes Istanbul, and St. Sophia becomes a mosque, one of the biggest mosques in the area. There it is. St. Sophia. It's still called St. Sophia. Holy Wisdom. You can't get rid of Sophia. But
did they add the minarets later?
Of course. The minarets didn't come with the original product. Minarets came later because they had to call people to worship. Now, what happened in Rome? The Roman Church. The Bishop of Rome we talked about. It had a lot of power because during the Roman Empire it was the capital city. And originally, as I said, all bishops were known by the Greek word papa, which means father, pope. And by the 4th century, it was used specifically the Bishop of Rome to designate his political power. When it was under that name that he attended the ecumenical councils, because he was considered to be one of the biggest shot bishops there were. The Bishop of Rome, the Bishop of Alexandria, the Bishop of Antioch, and a few other cities would be the really powerful guys politically. Rome fell to the Goths. The empire went east. By the 6th century, the Goths abandoned Rome, and it was built and rebuilt under Pope Gregory the Great. And then in the 7th, 8th centuries, it diverged from the Eastern churches, became the Roman Catholic, as I said, with a different time for Easter, a different doctrine, and the use of the Latin Vulgate Bible. And it was able to enforce its Catholicism through military conquest in Europe and its alliance with the 9th century Charlemagne, the Carolingians, Charles the Great, and in the British Isles an alliance with the Normans, who were the French rulers that conquered in the 12th century. And there was always, after that, conflict for secular power, political power, with the royal houses of Europe. The royal houses of Europe essentially came out of the generals and their bastard sons and their legitimate sons and everything of Charlemagne, of Charles the Great, Charlemagne, who did all the big conquesting later. We're not talking about Constantine now. We're going to jump from Constantine to Charlemagne in a little while, see what happened in between. And so they became what royalty to be, and that's what the definition of royalty. Whenever I have people that tell me they're royal descent and royal blood, I like to say, oh, so you're the son of some murderous bastard that conquered people with swords and peasants and whatever. Anyway, that's what royalty is. Now, there were the popes from the very beginning had been agitating for crusades of their political supporters against the Muslims. The very first was Charlemagne, who drove the Moors, the black Muslims, as far back from and out of Spain as possible, because they were encroaching into Europe, and that earned him the ever undying gratitude of the Pope of Rome at that time. And then after that, popes agitated for people to go back when the Byzantine Empire fell and all the holy relics of the East were taken over by the Muslims. They agitated people to go back on crusades and to reconquer the territories and things like that. So after the Protestant movement, we're talking about the popes here now. I'm giving you a little history of the popes. They led what was called the Counter-Reformation against the Protestants, which involved the Inquisition, Papal Inquisition, and things like that. And they allied with the nobility in all the states they ruled, and France and Spain were two big ones, and what would be one day called Italy, etc., were ruled by Catholic monarchs that were overseen and followed the orders of the Vatican. And when the French nobility were overthrown in the French Revolution, the first really big revolution of a Catholic country, then the church was, their authority was overthrown too, and the authority of the French Inquisition ended. They had major conflict with Freemasons. After all, the Freemasons were behind the French Revolution. They were behind the American Revolution. The Freemasons had ideas that had created ideas taken from Locke and Rousseau and so on about democracy, electing people, about the rights of man and all this sort of thing. And they were very principal big players in the overthrowing of monarchs, and very quickly an awful lot of anti-clerical feeling, and for darn good reason. And so the popes put out papal bulls against Freemasonry, and that still goes today, and now they're joined with the Christian fundamentalists in trying to defame Freemasonry, etc. The Italian nationalists reclaimed Rome in the 19th and 20th century, Garibaldi, the Carbonieri, and so on. And they left the Pope with his cathedral and palaces, which is now called Vatican City, and the Pope still has political influence. He still has secular power in the world through banks and through great amounts of money and things that, and property that are run through the Catholic Church. And so he is a force that has to be dealt with politically, just like any other major dude. And there's a view of Vatican City.
Looks really clean there.
How many peasants had to labor to build all that stuff, you suppose? Now, I talked about Zosimus of Panopolis because he's one of the people in the Grail tradition that we still have some documents from. He often quotes the Jewish matriarch of alchemy, Miriam or Mary of Alexandria. And as I say, Jewish alchemy is taboo to Jewish scholars, but a great Jewish scholar, and a real scholar, not just a journalist like somebody that writes Holy Blood, Holy Grail or something, but a real scholar works with primary sources and is able to intelligently evaluate them. A fellow named Patai, but really rejected by modern Orthodox rabbis and things. But he has gone back and started the process that Gershom Scholem and other people have done of looking into the esoteric background of Judaism, and there's a very strong background. Yeah. The writings of Zosimus that we have preserved by the Arabs show that the alchemical roots are in the Egyptian hieratic funeral sciences and priestly sciences. Miriam was probably a Hellenistic Jew who was initiated into the mysteries of Hermes Trismegistus. Notice that I spell Trismegistus with an OS because that's a Greek term, a Greek word, and that's how Greek words end. But you'll very often see it with a US because it's Latinized. I read you an example of the alchemical writings of Zosimus so that you got some flavor of it. So here's a book that's available these days, Raphael Patai, The Jewish Alchemists. If you're interested in the topic, there's one place.
There's a nice chapter on the
Yes. There's another one. This is the book that Willa introduced me to, being a goddess herself. It's his book on the Hebrew goddess. It's his book on Yahweh has got a feminine aspect, not just a masculine aspect. There's a father and mother there. Already was way before the time of Jesus. So if you want to learn about that, Patai will teach you a lot about those things.
He goes way back to.
Yeah. Now I want to talk about Arius because Arius is very important in the bringing of Christianity into Celtic lands, but not Catholic Christianity, a form of Christianity that's probably much more original, more like Messianic Judaism. Saint Arius, well, I call him Saint Arius, he wouldn't be called Saint Arius in the Catholic Church. Arius was a brilliant Alexandrian teacher. He was a spiritual teacher, lived in the 2nd, 3rd century, actually I should say the 3rd to 4th century. He taught that Jesus was the greatest of Jewish saints who achieved apotheosis and ascension like Enoch and Moses and Elijah had. But he was even greater than they were. He was human, he became divine at his death, and he showed humanity the divine way, and he became the Christ. Now, he was opposed by the proto-Orthodox bishops and supported by many other bishops, because there was a lot of controversy about things like this, but he was probably way closer to the Jewish messianic ideals than the teachings of Jesus himself and anyone else, than any of the Catholic people in the proto-Orthodox were. So he was one of the 3 bishops who voted against the Athanasian Creed in the First Council of Nicaea. The Athanasian Creed has a Trinity and all this kind of stuff, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, and the 3 guys and all that kind of stuff. He opposed the dogma that Jesus is divine and normal people are not, and he was condemned as a heretic, and he was banished. He died mysteriously. He was probably poisoned. Now his disciple was Ulfilas, who was a Goth. He was a Celtic dude, and he became the first missionary bishop to the Goths in Europe and Gaul. And partly because he was native, and partly because he was a great saint and a great healer, he was able to pass without bodyguards or anything else into all the tribes and talk to people and talk with all the Druid priests and things. And he very well probably had been a Druid priest or archpriest beforehand. And so he brought a form of Christianity that people could understand. It was Arius's form of Christianity, and it worked with Druidism really well. And so we had a form of Christianity called Celtic Christianity that was just fine. I would have been happy with it. So he established what we call the Druid Celtic Aryan Christianity that actually was what dominated Europe and England for 800 years. or 600 years. He gained the respect of the Druid priests because of his sanctity and his healing miracles, and he had students he trained and so on. So he set up priests. He was a bishop, so he ordained priests for the what we call the Gallican or Celtic churches. And that dominated what would become Europe for 5 centuries until the Catholic Church used military force to establish Roman Christianity in its place, thanks to Charlemagne, the Carolingians. Before Charlemagne, what existed? Well, we had the Merovingians. Now, the native Celtic churches in France, we had Gallican Christianity and missionaries in major cities, not in the countryside. They became educated Roman elite, and they were the ones who brought in the Greco-Roman, Pythagorean, all this other kind of intellectual stuff, and that got put into the mix there. So Rome, when there was Roman Christianity, it was very much colored with Greco-Roman and native Celtic stuff, because there were places that Roman Catholic Church sent missionaries in and had, for example, very early in Lyon, they had established a Catholic presence there, as opposed to a Celtic presence. But the symbols of Celtic Christianity remained the so-called pagan, except in this case, by pagan we don't mean Greek, we mean Druid. You know, for example, the Green Man. So this is actually this is a Green Man from Rosslyn Chapel in Scotland. You all know what the Green Man is. And so people like Bishop Irenaeus of Lyon spoke out not against Celtic Christianity, but against the Gnostics in Rome, the Gnostic churches in Rome in the 2nd century. And that's where we get a lot of our information about Gnostic churches, is from his polemic against them. And so, of course, it's not a real balanced information. You have to kind of look past the spin to see what was going on. And slowly, the areas in France were converted to Roman Catholic over about 7 centuries through a sustained effort of Rome. And there were Catholic ruling families established in Gaul. Yeah.
The Roman thing that was slowly converting was like the Inquisition, where they were killing everybody.
No, there was no Inquisition yet. We don't have an Inquisition. No. What it was is there were Catholic missionaries from Rome sent in to educate or re-educate the local people, and then over generations and centuries, usually they went to the wealthy people, the ruling class, and converted them because they were more sophisticated. They would travel to Rome, and that was considered to be the big city, you know, and all this sort of thing. So that's how that happened, but that happened in certain enclaves and spots. Now, in the British Isles, we had Anglican Christianity. You're used to these Pictish images and things like this. To the 5th century, all the way up to the 5th century, most of the priests in Celtic Christianity in the British Isles probably were archdruids as well. They did both of these because the most holy people were considered to be the bards. The bards were bards like Taliesin, and he was a prince bard and a Christian scholar, because to them it was all one thing. There was nothing, you know. And Catholic Christianity didn't really have doctrine and dogma that said you can't be a druid and you can't this and that. So to about the 5th century, that's the form of Christianity we had in England, and it was, again, it would be like if you had a Christianity and American Indians and then it all merged together, you would work out that way, you know. But Augustine of Kent made an attempt to Catholicize the British Isles in the 6th century. Now, this is not St. Augustine of Hippo, which we talk about in other places. But he found there a native Celtic Christianity that had been well established since the 1st century, and that was not going to very easily and quickly change its ways. In the 11th century, and actually the 12th century would be the 1100s. By the Battle of Hastings was 1066. It gets to be the 11th century. The French ruling families and knights who wanted to claim the throne of what we would call England came over in a big invasion. We call it the Norman Conquest, the Norman invasion. At the Battle of Hastings, they wiped everybody out. And then they tried to get everybody to change their religion to Catholic stuff. And so all the Celtic monks who were used to keeping certain hours to do their prayers and to do different things were ordered to stop doing their prayers at those hours and do them at other hours. But they refused to do so, and they knelt down to do their prayers at the proper time. So they brought their archers in and they butchered them all, slaughtered them at prayer. And they were doing it. It's a good way to make friends, yeah. So French Catholicism was imposed upon the English in the Norman Conquest. Yeah.
Well, there was something significant, though, about getting someone at prayer. Not just that they're vulnerable, but it's to show that our God is greater than your God, because you were praying to your God and he didn't protect you, and so that shows that our God is better.
Yeah.
So it's just a psychological technique that I think is still common.
Or it's just a
today.
way for them to get them all in one place at the same time, maybe. I don't
You're
know.
saying that they were lazier than they were smart.
I don't know what they were. I'm sure that, I know that terrorists, Sunni terrorists wipe out, the other folks, when they're in their when they're in their temples and their mosques, and then vice versa. So I don't know. In Germany, there were the Franks and the Goths. There was Frankish and Gothic native Celtic churches. Germanic Druidic Christianity remained until about the 9th century, and in fact, the same location and areas that would eventually be made safe for Protestantism. And they were forcibly converted to Catholicism by Charlemagne and his bishop, Alcuin, who was a spiritual advisor. We'll learn more about them. So, where did the Holy Grail symbols come? The sun, Grail symbols. Well, the magical cauldron was a symbol that went way back, and we talked about, is it Ceridwen? Is that how we pronounce it? Ceridwen, yeah. The cauldron of Ceridwen. It's a magical healing thing. You see, the kind of alchemy that the Druids were involved in was not the alchemy of metals, but the alchemy of plants and stones and medicines. And it goes all the way back probably to Neanderthal man, a whole different species of humans, the use of plants for healing. And there were great skills, and women were really the people who were experts in this. And very often the way they mixed things is by boiling them in a cauldron. So the idea of the crone who could create these healing herbal medicines or poisons, it was the same thing. There were warriors who probably worked with metallurgy and alchemy and so on. But the idea of a magical cauldron where things were mixed together and transformed became a big thing in Celtic mythology. People would go there to be brought back from the dead or to be made young again, and this sort of thing, So that's a symbol of the cauldron. This is a bowl for divination. It's called a Gundestrup cauldron, and there's not a lot of archaeology that can show a lot of things, because there were things have been taken by the Romans and all kinds of people in British Isles. But if we look at this bowl, it's a bowl that was used for divination, probably by filling with water and scrying the moon or something. And on it we find the constellation of Boötes. And in 5,700 years before the Christian era, at that time the pole star was in the constellation of Boötes. And probably this is where their legends of the first shaman and so on go back and things. This is what the constellation looks like. it was a very important constellation, and it was where the pole star, everything revolved around that. So it was the great man of the sky. Well, the bowl is not 3,700 years old, but it has on it the constellation of Bootes, which was at the center of the universe, so to speak, in this era. So now we're going back behind the Aryan period, behind the Taurian period, to what, the Geminian period or something, and that's where the pole star is right now.
That's where the what?
The pole star, everything revolved around that star. And because of the precession of the equinox. Now, our pole star right now it's a little bit off the center, but it'll be way off in another 2,000 years or something, because the precession of equinox moves things around. Also in Celtic Christianity, they designated sacred places, magical places, places that were special places, just like the Greeks had, where there was a connection between the divine underworld and the normal mundane world, or places where magical things had happened, or special divine things that happened, like in the Hebrew stories in the Old Testament, places where an angel wrestled Gabriel, and therefore, or an angel wrestled Jacob, and therefore this is called such and such, and so on. Sacred springs were especially important because springs were really necessary, and you've been to some of these sacred springs. These sacred springs that now have a Christian thing, Chalice Well, they were things way before they were Chalice Well. They were other things. So, is that where you went, Chalice Well? Yeah. Yeah, that's a sacred spring, but it was sacred way before anybody ever heard of Jesus Christ, I'll tell you that. And this is part of this tradition. And Christianity, therefore, that developed was pantheistic. That means that it's monotheistic, but it means that it understood that everything was animated. Probably a better word would be animism or something, but everything was alive, everything had a soul. It was very similar to what Pythagoreans thought, when we call it transmigration of the soul. And therefore, that was not acceptable to Roman Catholicism. Roman Catholicism will do is come into places where the Indians or someone has religion. They'll take their sacred places, like in Santa Cruz, where what is that church?
Mission.
Yeah, Mission Santa Cruz, is built on top of an Indian sacred place. Probably because, not just in order to wipe out the Indian, pagan stuff, but also because it was considered a sacred place to them. Knights Templar built cathedrals on ancient sacred places that were Celtic sacred places, etc.
One of the things I understand is that according to the Pythagorean theory, is that you, by your belief of its magical quality, you actually created it. So there's a lot of baraka built up in those places.
Yeah.
The place itself became activated.
That's why it's important to go there, to those places, because but by the same token, that's how an egregor of something is built up. There's an egregor of the Catholic Church, which can be very nasty. It's an egregor that makes you feel like if it feels good, it's bad, and if it feels bad, it's good, and things like that. There's a whole egregor of the Catholic Church, and there's some very nasty forces that can come after you when you mess with the Catholic Church and curse you. And I know, because I've had to mess with them. It was very shamanic, geomantic. There was a lot of there wasn't written stuff down. People learned everything orally, and then they sometimes put symbols on. Later on, they used runes and things like that. But this is all taught orally. It was not written down through any kind of books. So Jesus was seen in this form of religion as the world shaman. He's the first shaman. He's the world shaman who teaches people shamaning and saves people. And so, therefore, what became important there would be magical relics of Jesus, like the foreskin of Jesus, which we'll be talking about in a little while. Magical relic of the foreskin.
How do they know whose foreskin it is?
Well, that's not the issue. If generation of generation have venerated as the foreskin of Jesus, it is the foreskin of Jesus, whether Jesus likes it or not. So, anyway.
whether Jesus lost it.
Yeah, right. And how did anybody preserve it? My God.
Desiccated.
It is, they actually say they have that?
Well, I'm going to tell you about the foreskin of Jesus.
Oh, this is great.
Okay, now the dynasty of people that ruled at that time were called the Merovingians. They were the long-haired rulers of the Gauls. Their symbol, the way they identified themselves is they didn't cut their hair. They kept it very, very long. That, by the way, was how one gained power in battle. You abstained from women and sex for a week or two before you went into battle, and you never cut your hair. And you know, in Hebrew, among the Hebrew prophets and things, not cutting your hair was considered a way to keep your mojo and so on.
That's
Same
like
for the-
Samson.
Yeah, Samson.
Same for the Sikhs. When I was
Yeah,
being
yeah.
a Sikh, you never cut your hair.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Hey, I'm powerful and I cut my hair all the time. I even
Imagine
shave
how
my beard.
powerful you'd be if you let it grow.
I don't need it. I don't need it from that. Okay, so this is Clovis, one of the rulers of the Franks, I believe it was. This is a depiction of him holding his one of his. It looks like a minaret. It's not. It's a kind of construction that Gothic construction was, and the long-haired Merovingians claimed a bloodline from the gods. They said that their original parents, was a human person and a god. Sort of like after Plato died, people said that he was a demigod because his mother had gone into a temple of Zeus and been impregnated by Zeus, etc. Any remarkable person was considered to be not really a normal human. If you were somebody really talented, remarkable, and you did a lot of these things, then you was said, well, actually, he was the result of sacred intercourse between his mother and a god. So it was demigod. So these people said that their bloodline came from the gods. By the way, they never claimed to be descendants of Jesus and Mary Magdalene. That was that claim was made in the 20th century, not by the Merovingian rulers. That probably goes to the hoaxer we talked about, Pierre Plantard. We've talked about him before. I'll say a little bit more about him. The Gallican legend of Mary Magdalene and Joseph of Arimathea bringing the Holy Grail or cup of the Last Supper to Gaul originated in the 11th century. That's the first time we hear it. It did not originate during the Merovingian period. So the Merovingians were not claiming their authorities from Jesus or Mary Magdalene or anything like that. And all the stories of Mary going there developed later. The golden legends came after this period. Do you know the golden legends of Mary Magdalene? How she's an ascetic saint, she's doing penance. If you've done the Mary Magdalene seminar, I do a long thing on this. She's up in a cave and she's living on nothing but the Holy Eucharist, and she's ascending up into heaven every day. But what she's doing is doing penance for her sins as a whore, which she has to do until she dies. But she was not the wife of Jesus, nor was she a harlot. So you've got to see the seminar on Mary Magdalene, if you haven't already. Now, in the mid-20th century, I've already talked to you about it, but I'm going to put it on this seminar, Pierre Plantard, who was a rightist right-wing royalist who thought that he should be the king of France, and was many people involved in esoteric orders and esoteric are very right-wing, and they want to have titles and things like this. And he planted forged documents all over the European libraries and archives that are researched by people for esoteric information and also for genealogy to support his claim of a child of Mary Magdalene and Jesus, and that was the basis of the Merovingian dynasty. And now I should say, moreover, and that the secret was guarded by the Priory of Sion, an order that and that he was a descendant of Jesus because he also planted things to try to show that he was a descendant of the Merovingians. So therefore, he should be the person who would be elected to be the lifelong president of France after World War II. He was in competition with people Who was the guy that was the big general that made
Charles
it?
de Gaulle.
Yeah, it was Charles de Gaulle. He was trying to compete with the likes of Charles de Gaulle. He was, when France was under the Vichy government, he was a big rightist, and he wrote all kinds of, a bunch of fascist stuff and things like that.
Wasn't it the Merovingians that were wiped out by the Catholic Church?
No. No, well, let's see, they weren't wiped out. Their dynasty ended. The Carolingians came into being. But the Merovingians lost most of their holdings. And in order to throw a bone to them, because there was so much loyalty to them, after Charlemagne had wiped out all these people, a descendant of the Merovingian families was made given a title to rule over a very small little hill in Jerusalem called Sion, Mount Sion. And that's where the Priory of Sion was established, and where the Templars went, and all kinds of myths and legends developed about the massive treasure from the temple and the Priory of Sion and this kind of stuff. Anyway, the authors of Holy Blood, Holy Grail unwittingly used all these forged documents to for their book to claim that Mary Magdalene and Jesus had a child, and that was a big deal. These people are not scholars; they're journalists, and they both have recognized that they had wrong information. But if you ever want to read really wonderful tales, there it is. Now, Margaret Starbird later interpreted the Grail that was supposed to have been brought to France in the 11th century, golden legend about Mary Magdalene, as a code for a secret child of Mary Magdalene and Jesus, using information from Holy Blood, Holy Grail. And so we got our modern urban legend about, Jesus and Mary Magdalene having a child. Everybody loves it, and everybody wants it to be that way, because we need a little femininity in our religion, and we need to have some sex, for God's sake, And we well know that we need these things. So the Merovingian claim of descent from the gods became in the 20th century an urban legend that Merovingians descended from the holy bloodline of Mary Magdalene and Jesus. And of course that this stooge up here in the corner of the screen, Plantard, should be the president of France for life, because he's a descendant of Jesus Christ. Boy, I'll tell you, genetics don't do much, do they? So the Merovingian dynasty grew very weak and corrupt in the 8th century. And they were no longer able to defend their territories. This is in the 700s or so. And they begin to lose them as the Moorish, these are the black Muslims, gained more footholds in Spain and moved up and towards Gaul and things like this, which scared the heck out of the Pope, a bunch of people, because these people were not Catholics by a long shot. So they were unable to actually to defend against these Arabic invasions. So native Christian churches of Gaul and the British Isles had these things that I'm calling the roots of what will become the medieval Grail. There were Celtic roots. This is supposed to be a Druid priest. There were Greco-Roman roots that came from Mithraic things and Pythagorean. There was a Christian synthesis. There was Manichaeism, Gnostic stuff with 3 grades of initiation, Jewish mysticism, Kabbalah, Islamic mysticism, Pythagorean, Hermetic. Finally, even the reason I keep mentioning the Masons is because the science of mathematics and architecture and building with stone is a very ancient thing, and it has continuity through families. In fact, the one lineage that really goes through is how you transmit the knowledge of how to build buildings from generation to generation. And it's clear that it wasn't something that was picked up new every generation or every 100 years. It was something that developed and grew. And it grew through these Masonic guilds. And so there was a guild tradition in the Roman Hellenistic period, not just for builders and architects, but also for other kinds of groups. And they usually had 3 grades of initiation. You would start out as an apprentice, and then a fellow at the craft, and then you would be a master, if you go that way. Now, there was what we called negative gnosis that was carried into medieval Europe by Manichaeism, the Cathari. You would see the Gnosticism seminar on that. But basically, Mani, as we said, was the prophet of the Persian areas who came up with a religion that was kind of a cross between Christianity and Zoroastrianism, but it involved asceticism and stuff like that. We don't have very much left of it, but we know a lot about it because it was kept going in communities. They were like Puritan communities where there were these certain holy men who never married and didn't have any children, and they were fed and cared for by other people, and they would not step on a bug or anything like that. But your normal grunts and people that would marry and things like that, he would be atoning for your sins, and maybe in another life you would become, one like this. These were the pure. And there were 3 grades of initiation. There's quite a lot to study. That's in the Gnostic seminar. There were the Jewish Kabbalistic mystics and their communities that carried on this thing. Kabbalah was not something that was written down. The first Kabbalistic literature from the 1st or 2nd century is the oldest, which is the Sefer, the book of Yetzirah, formation, which we have, and we have some less original and more original versions of it. But the first real writing of Jewish Kabbalah that was transmitted orally happens in the medieval Europe with the Lurian Gnosis and other kinds of things, and Luria's contribution of the Sephirotic tree and things like that. But this tradition is maintained. This is Shlomo ben Yitzhak in France, who was from a Kabbalistic family that maintained these traditions all the way through the Middle Ages. This is a representation, you see, by the way, things like this on a tarot card, but this is a representation of Isaac Luria, who was almost a messianic figure and developed his system and wrote the book. It was books like the Zohar that really transformed a lot of Kabbalah. And that came from a lot of influences, and we don't know all of them, but were mostly oral. And they contained these legends. And if you read the book you all probably got, what is the one I had you get that was collection of all kinds of the Other Gospel, I think it was. The Other Bible, yes. The Other Bible has a lot of good Kabbalistic stuff and legends in it that you can read. And then there was Islamic mysticism, because Jewish Merkaba mysticism, the ascent into the heavens, and the Gnostic heavens, becomes a part of the mystic traditions of Islam. And it's kind of hard. Actually, it's really probably stretching it to say that Sufism is part of regular Islam, because it's probably...
It's much older.
Yeah, it's much older than that. This is a Sufi manuscript, a very old Sufi writing that is based on Kabbalistic ideas that are related to the Sephirot and to the heavens. And I can't read it. It's all in Arabic or something. But I do know that it was related to the mysticism of ascent. And that's all I know. And I think that the way you Sufis get up there is by whirling around and dancing and doing some things like that. And you're the expert, so you're a sheikh. You could tell me more about that. But that was going on too. And those influences were not in opposition to Christianity, because most people that were doing these kinds of things came into contact with each other through the great centers of civilization, and people that were interested in it, just like you are. You are interested not just in one religion, but many things. And people like this that were enlightened people, they were interested in talking to masters and adepts and things like that. And that's how this information all got shared. And that's why so much of the world's mysticism just mixes into other things. But it's always at these top levels.
It's only 7.
Yeah. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then the bottom makes 7. Even on the Lurianic tree, the 7 lower Sephirot are the ones that are actually transformed in the different worlds. The top 3 are the immortal or the eternal ones that do not change, and so the 7 heavens, the 7 planets, and things like that. As you can see, this is this particular document is not in Latin, it's not in Greek, it's not in Egyptian, it's not in Sanskrit, it's in Arabic. And that civilization was very, very important. It came into Egypt in the 7th century. It ruled until the 16th century. Here's a painting from the Military Museum in Cairo of this invasion. So it lasts from 641 to 1517 in the Christian era. But after the invasion was over and political control was gained, there was a great deal that was learned from the native inhabitants of the city as they were converted and as conversations about theology and God were had and so on. The Arabs preserved and developed this ancient knowledge, as we've said before. They had remnants of the Library of Alexandria from the community in Akhmim or Panopolis. And they preserved and they developed classical, Hermetic, and Pythagorean sciences. And this is, they developed and they translated the writings of the Greek philosophers and mathematicians and architects. They invaded India and learned the Hindu secret arts and Vedic Jyotish to some extent. I don't know what extent they finally did, but they did have quite a very advanced astrology. And they became the adepts of the mysterious Middle East. It was to them that Christian Rosenkreutz would go for his knowledge. It was to the mysterious East, to the great Islamic adepts that the people in Europe would go for their knowledge and understanding after the Renaissance. Grail legends are always set in quests to the East. You're always going to the East, the mysterious East. It's the source of knowledge for the Renaissance in Europe. And of course the manuscripts of the Greek philosophers and alchemists were sold to Europeans. They were like artifacts. They were worth great money, and so people made a lot of money selling them, and then they were translated. The Arabs copied them down literally in Greek, and so then people could translate them from Greek or from Latin, and they didn't have to translate them from Arabic. And the Hermetic Renaissance was sparked with Ficino's translation of the Corpus Hermeticum for the Medicis in the 16th century, about. This is a great mosque with minarets, and the architecture of these mosques was originally learned by when Arabs developed their own architecture and their own architects from the Roman architects. It's Roman architecture that actually determines the shape of how these are going to be built. So let's talk about the Masons. There were 800 years of architectural and building skills that developed in Rome and in the Roman Empire. And it was continuous development of tradition. It may be true that things like the number pi and the understanding of Pythagorean right triangle and things like that existed before the Romans, before the Greeks, may have been developed in India or China. But all this kind of information was brought together. So there was all this synthesis going on in the building of things. Jesus was from a builder's family. His father was a tectone. A tectone does not mean a carpenter. It means a person who works in building. And the only material in Galilee to build with was stone. He was a stonemason. Yeah.
I've seen the word tectone and technone.
It's tectone. I mean, sorry, maybe it's technone. What is it?
I only have one semester of modern Greek,
yes,
so I'm
right.
not sure.
Let's see. I think it is a technone. Anyway, we get the word technology from that. So, and they were trained, and his family lineage, if you look at the lineage in the Gospel of Matthew, the father's lineage, goes back to Zerubbabel, who was the person who was trained in, there was no tradition in Hebrew of stonemasonry. Solomon's temple had to be built by foreigners. It was not built by Hebrews, and it was some of the work in the temple was done by Hebrew artisans, but they had to bring foreign people in to do this. They have the legends of foreign masons that are brought in, like Hiram Abif. And of course, that Hiram Abif is actually probably an Arabic name, and it's got corrupted along the way. But it was during the Babylonian captivity that Jews learned and were trained by people in stonemasonry and the building of buildings. And when the second temple was built, it was built by Jewish masons. And then the stonemasonry was transmitted down the generations from father to the oldest son, father to the oldest son, and that's probably why Jesus was the oldest son in the family, because we're told that he was also the son of the carpenter and he worked as a carpenter and so on. Anyway, these traditions went down through families, and there was a great deal of complex things that went with it, mathematics and other things. These are some of the symbols of the Roman Masons. We find these carved into buildings. Sometimes they're Greek and sometimes they're Latin. And they're called the Mason's Mark. We have in Freemasonry Mark Masonry. And the mark of the Mason is, it had various purposes for different kinds of things, because when you made a cut in a stone of a mark, sometimes it would tell you where something went, sometimes it would tell you who did it, or sometimes it would tell you what guild did it, and it could tell many different things. But these same marks that we find in the Roman buildings, we find in the Gothic cathedrals. So there's continuity of tradition, or similar marks. And the development, however, of Masonry developed different styles, Corinthian and Ionian and things like this. And so it was not just a static form of stuff. It was developing, and people would develop it and make it better and do different things. And then these would be kept and passed on down. So there was a deposit, what St. Paul called parodosis, the tradition that has adding things to it and changing it, brought down. They were organized in builders' guilds, and it combined religious and trade organizations. So you were not just a professional. Everything back in the ancient world was religious as well as anything else. Just like the soldiers became mostly initiated into the mysteries of Mithra, the builders were initiated into some kind of form of Greek religion or Roman religion. And the Jewish Masons would have been initiated into some mystic form of their own religion, was probably Kabbalistic. There was initiation into 3 grades: an apprentice, where you were beginning and you were learning and you did all the grunt work, and a journeyman, which is about as far as an awful lot of people ever got, because most people didn't have the smarts to do the mathematics and all the other kinds of stuff. And then a very few people became masters, and the masters were free masons in terms of the stonemasons, because they would not only work in Rome, they would be a really great master mason would be invited to go to some other country and paid a lot of money to bring people together and teach them how to do things and build buildings for other people. And so in those days, you couldn't just take off and travel like we do today. There are people that did things like this, but you had to know people. You had to know how to get around, or otherwise you'd just get robbed or you get ripped off, because you were going from tribe to tribe, like going in a city that's ruled by different gangs, and you don't walk into this area or you're in trouble. But Freemasons could go anywhere. And how would a Freemason know another Mason? Secret signs. How did you know that somebody was really a Mason, was really a master? Only another master could tell, because the masters had a secret way of knowing. It might have been a secret handshake, or it might have been a word or something like that. The problem that people had in Paris when the first universities were developed and people were trained, and then they were doctors, and they could go out to villages and they could charge money for teaching. And then they found some other guy who said he was a doctor, but in fact he had never been there. Nobody had ever heard of him. He was a phony. Finally, the Pope had to put out a papal bull that said, we're going to give something to you that says you did this training. And that was the first degree. And it had a stamp on it, and you took it with you. He said, yes, I went to the University of Notre Dame, and I am a real doctor. I'm not a phony. Well, that's what the Masons did, but they did it in a different kind of way. They would recognize each other. When you came into their territory, you had to be recognized. And when you get into Freemasonry, you'll learn about these things. They had to flee Rome after the Gothic invasions. They were not very welcome there. They were certainly not going to build anything for the Goths. And they built a fortified community on Lake Como, which is sort of up in the Alps, bordering Italy, up in the Alps. And Lake Como is a good place where you can defend yourself. And these people were, an awful lot of these people were probably Pythagoreans, because they were tech people. And so they knew how to build weapons of defense and how to make special kinds of battlements of defense, etc. Here are some of the marks we find up on Lake Como that are Masons' marks, or that are indications that there were Masons living in that community. The Italians are the people that really know about this, and they're the people that publish things around it. Nobody in America heard much about it until a woman in the 19th century published information about this, and then of course it was a woman who said it, so it couldn't be true, and so all the Masons knocked it and everything else. But now modern scholars pretty much accept the fact that there was this big community, and that was kind of the center of where Rome's deposit of architectural knowledge went. And these are some of the artifacts we find up there from where that community was, that represent either Masonic artifacts or Masonic symbols that were used at the time from Rome. As I said, the masters had the immunity of passage into all countries, and they could bring a journeyman along with them, or other journeymen to help them. So they were hired by Christian rulers, by Islamic rulers, and other rulers to design and oversee buildings of churches and cathedrals and mosques. And so the whole tradition of building in stone all over Europe, this goes back a long way. If you take the seminar on Freemasonry, which is mostly about ancient Freemasonry and its roots in Rosslyn Chapel and so on, I go into the antiquity of the Masonic enterprise, and how building stone with stone first was initiated in Egypt and things like that. So they built, for the East and the West, they built these incredible buildings that stand in Rome, and we don't know why they stand, because we can't figure out how the roof of how the roof of some of the buildings can even stand up, because they're not designed with modern things, but they figured out ways to make them work, and they're still standing.
It'd be interesting to note how many failures they might have had along the way.
They could have had all kinds of failures, because I'm sure they learned by trial and error, and then they found it, that by doing this and by doing that. But as I say, you look at some of the Islamic, the Muslim construction, all the techniques that were learned in Rome are incorporated, but entirely different design, because there were other people. There had to be minarets, and there had to be this and that. So you have Islamic structures, and you have the great Gothic cathedrals of Europe, all based on the same set of knowledge and the same kind of people. And we know that Masonic guilds go very early. They came to Britain in the 5th or 6th century. They had to be imported to build churches and things for the Christians, but by the 8th century, 9th century, we have actually established Masonic guilds under certain kings. King Ethelwerd and some people like this brought in Masons, and they have a Mason's code and a religious idea and so on. So up to the modern period, in the 17th century, to protect themselves from the persecution of Cromwell and Protestants and Catholics, the noble families, descendants of the Templars and other people, had made alliances with the Masons, because the Templars are the people who built all the great cathedrals of Europe, and their buddies were the companions. They were the builders, the Masons, in their societies. And when Cromwell made it illegal for people to meet in public in order to discuss Hermetic philosophy and other acts of the devil, they found that there was one place they could meet. They could meet in their buddies' pubs. Their buddies were the stonemasons, who were willing to protect them. And they had protected them when they were exiled, when they were chased out on Friday the 13th in the 14th century, or the 13th century, and whatever it was, I'm trying to remember, I think it was the 14th century. And then they established what had already been established at Rosslyn Chapel and earlier. They established what was called a special kind of Mason, who was not an operative Mason. He was a speculative Mason, as we called it. He was initiated and he was part of the Brotherhood, but he didn't go out and chip out stones and do things like that. But he could come to the meetings and discuss things, and so Freemasonry, as we know it today, developed in 17th century England before the American Revolution. And more about that later. Now let's take a look at what the early Grail synthesis was among the Merovingians then in Europe. We have Druidic and pantheistic religion, which has made all of its contributions. We have Mithraism and the Greco-Roman synthesis, which has influenced the Druidic and pantheistic religion through the incursions of the Romans, and which in itself is transmitted in some of the cities of France and places like that through the Roman families intact. We have the Celtic churches, which include the Gallican and the British Isles and so on, and they have brought together their Arian ideas, the ideas of Arius about Christianity, and that becomes part of that synthesis. And pantheistic Druid religion, of course, strongly influences Celtic Christianity. And the Roman synthesis strongly influences Celtic Christianity as well. And then we have Catholic Christian mysticism, and there's a whole bunch of that we haven't talked about. This is not dogmatic Catholicism, but Christian mysticism. And that is brought into, through monastic traditions and things, into the early Grail synthesis that we have in Merovingian Europe. And then we have Jewish Kabbalistic mysticism. Believe it or not, there were Jews living in Christian cities. In fact, there were Jews in Europe, there were Jews in Gaul, there were Jews in England. And they brought through their families their own separate traditions. And then there were the Roman Masonic guilds that we just talked about. And they had their influence rather late in the Celtic churches, as the churches finally started building cathedrals and hiring these people to come out. And so there was dialogue with them there. And so all this puts together what I call the Grail synthesis. Then there was the Gnostic and Manichaean impulse, which is limited pretty much to the East. But later in the early development of the medieval period, we had the Bogomiles and the Cathars, and they contribute their ideas as well. And all this is sitting around hanging there, at the time when Charlemagne comes along and takes over Europe and establishes royalty and makes all the connections with the Catholic Church and everything else. And then we have what we call Islamo-Moorish mysticism, which has made its habitation in Spain and other kinds of places, and that is part of the mix, and there is a lot of intercultural mix that happens in Spain. Spain is one of the highest forms of civilization. Before Ferdinand and Isabella and the wipeout of all the Islamic influence in Spain, and Spain is turned to a whole Catholic nation and all the Jews are expelled. Before that happens, there is a great civilization that flourishes in Spain, and it is the Christian, Jewish, Islamic civilization that is probably the high point of medieval civilization before Catholicism exerts its control. So now, the Carolingians, the 9th century, there are these invasions that threaten to overrun Spain and Rome. The head of the Franks, which was called Austrasia back then, is the Pippin dynasty. There's Pippin the Weird and Pippin the Fat and Pippin the Two-Headed and so on. There's lots of different Pippins. Charles was the illegitimate son, and the Pippins were devout Catholics. They were one of the little enclaves where Catholicism had made them devout, because they were different than the peasants and all the other people. They were not participating in these pagan mysteries and things like this. And the Merovingians had become ineffective, and so these families had to assume the military defense of Spain and Gaul. And
Had they
Charles,
cut their hair or something, or?
they didn't need to grow their hair out or cut their hair or anything because they hadn't cut their hair. They just were lousy warriors. They were just fat and happy and sassy, and they weren't good warriors anymore. So Charles the Great, Charlemagne was a great warrior and knight and general, and a very brilliant person. He was the kind of person who could raise up soldiers, train them, get them to do incredible acts of bravery in battle, etc. And he's known as Charlemagne, Charles the Great. There he is. There's one picture. He's very devout Catholic. He drove the infidels back to the sea. The Pope then crowned him Defender of the Faith on Christmas Day on AD 800. He went to Rome. And he didn't know exactly what to expect. But he was crowned as Defender of the Faith. And with his advisor, Bishop Alcuin, he established and required all Catholic clerical education for all Gallican priesthood. In other words, all the Christian priests now had to be re-educated. They had to learn to read Latin, and they had to understand Catholic dogma and all this kind of stuff. And they established what were called the canons of the cathedral. At the bishop's cathedrals, they would have a school. It was known as a canon. It really means the rules, but it's a place where they would have school for all the clergy, many of whom could read runes, but they couldn't read Latin. And they destroyed all traces of Druidic religion and native Celtic Christianity by force of arms. And they got the clergy literate in Latin, and they ended the Merovingian dynasty and established the Carolingian dynasty. And he placed his generals as rulers over many lands, dukes and things over many different kinds of areas, people he could trust. And they, of course, were all Catholic. And this ushered in what we call the Carolingian era of Europe, which establishes the European royal houses. Now, here's one of my favorite pictures. Cutting down the great oak of the Christian Druids. One of the ways he did it was by destroying their symbols and the great oaks that were used, that were sacred trees and things like this. He cut them all down. He went and searched them all out and had them whacked down. Bound the priests, the Druidic priests, many of whom were Christian priests as well. Bound them with handcuffs and oversaw the wiping out of these pagan sites.
Needless to say, none of those guys asked that tree's permission.
No, of course not. I don't think they asked the tree's permission. Now, the canons of the cathedral were the places where this indoctrination took place. They were actually the beginnings of what would become the whole university system of Europe, which started out as Catholic places of Catholic education. And it was pretty much done by rote memory, just like a catechism is today in the Catholic Church. People would be told these things, and then they'd have to repeat them. And so they used a lot of memorization and rote memorization and catechizing, and that's how they learned doctrine. But they also taught them to read Latin. They made them literate. Big mistake. Never make the people you want to control literate. It backfired. That became the seed of the European universities and the Protestant Reformation and the Renaissance. So they made a big mistake by making the clergy literate, because they can now start to read, and that meant that they could find the ideas of other people, and you know what happens when you give people that kind of stuff, just like giving a 12-year-old a computer, and before you know it, he's on all the porno sites, whatever. And they instituted the court of the emperor, where issues were judged and political power was delegated. This is supposed to be a drawing of Charlemagne making judgments and decisions. And this was a civil court. Now, until this time in the Catholic Church, the only courts were Catholic courts. And there got to be big conflicts between civil courts, the court meant, court of the king, but a civil court now means a law court, and canonical courts. Now, in England, if you've ever read The Pardoner's Tale or anything, I'm going to talk a little about that in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales and things. The church was in charge of the morality of everybody, and so the bishop would designate a an archdeacon, and the deacon would designate people, and if someone was accused of saying a bad word like bloody, which means by Our Lady, or of having an adulterous affair with a neighbor or anything like that, then the person was called up and taken to court for moral offenses, and if found guilty would be shackled publicly, and people would throw tomatoes at him and whack his feet and do things like that, you know, the stocks, like what the Puritans did. That was the church courts, and then there were, in competition now, the clerical courts. And this was the actual state courts, the courts of the kings. So there were now two systems of law that were being established. Now the courts of the kings were based on the jurisprudence of the Holy Roman Empire. So that means that Carolingian stuff followed the code of Justinian and the other Byzantine kings. So this became what Hitler called the Second Reich, the Second Rule, the new Holy Roman Empire, after the decline of the Byzantine Empire over in Turkey, modern-day Turkey. And so the people who were the descendants and the people who came after Charlemagne and ruled were now called the Holy Roman Emperors, because his title went from defender of the faith to eventually emperor of the empire, the Roman Empire, the Holy Roman Empire. And his generals became rulers of emerging European nations, and the nobility established their own chivalric orders of knighthood and secular nation states and courts, and that came into conflict very soon, as you can see, with the church. The church established monastic orders and ecclesiastical courts and papal armies. So as you can see, this was a setup for some real competition between the church and the state very early on. This is supposed to be a medieval drawing of knights jousting, but chivalric orders were the secular version of esoteric religious orders. The children, or the sons of a ruler, would train and become knights. Three stages. 1, 2, 3, just like in Freemasonry, just like in the mystery schools. And you would start out being a squire, or rather you'd start out being a page. You'd be serving knights, and then you'd become a squire. And then when you got really good, you were finally dubbed a knight. And then your wife would be dubbed a dame. And things like this, you know, and this is how nobility was transpired and transmitted down and so on. So where did the concept of the Holy Roman Emperor come from, and the Holy Roman Empire? Well, basically the royalty of Europe came down and descended through Charlemagne and the generals of Charlemagne and the people associated with the Carolingian kind of takeover of Europe. Here we have one of the monograms or symbols that was applied for Charlemagne's rule. And on the 25th of December in the year 800 of the Christian era, Charlemagne waited patiently in Rome for the Pope to come out. In fact, it is said that he was kept out in the snow for some time to come forth and proclaim him not as an emperor of all the lands that he was really de facto in charge of, but to proclaim him a great ally and a grand ally of the church. For this, we still have the garment that was worn by him. It was of a deeply religious and Catholic nature, and we have him represented as not just a normal ruler or emperor, but as one who rules on behalf of God under the advisement of the Pope and papal courts and so on. And what he was declared by the Pope, essentially, as he was crowned, was defender of the faith. Now, many years later, when Napoleon came and gave himself the Emperor's crown of France, he put the crown on his own head in a very distinct defiance of this idea that any kind of ruler or monarch of a secular country would have any kind of obeisance to a religious figure, especially in the French Revolution. Anti-clericalism was one of the main tenets, and destroying the power of the Catholic Church and the royalty over the people in France was a big issue. But this is what really began the domination of papal power over secular nations and over secular Europe, and what really started the whole concept that would eventually intertwine nobility with papal control. Now, what were the holy grail objects of the Carolingians? In the Western Church, the Eucharist was a very important thing. It was considered to be the body and blood of the Christ, and it had been from earliest times. So that the Eucharist was considered to be a totally sacred kind of object that was actually the flesh and blood of Christ. It was a magic transformative food. It represented spiritual rebirth, physical healing. In the medieval period, people would take the hosts home without the priest seeing it, and they'd use it as poultices for boils and for magical recipes and things like that. You know, they were good things to have around the house. So that was the church's idea of what the Eucharist was. The Eucharist was the magical, transformative medicine of Christianity. In the Eastern Church, the Mandylion, which would later become the Crown of Turin, was a great object, a great Grail object. It was, that's all people could see of it, because photography hadn't been invented yet, and you couldn't get a negative image of it. But that image was enough that for people to study and meditate, for them to come up with most of the kinds of images you find in iconography in the Eastern Church. And you see on our altar here, you notice the this little bits of hair coming down here. See the same thing here. And when you look at this, that's what you see, but it's probably blood. It's probably not hair. But that's the traditional image, and it's made from that. The Knights Templar, after after Byzantium or Constantinople had been sacked by the Muslims and had been destroyed, they went in to try to retrieve and get back Christian artifacts that were being desecrated by the Muslims. And they found apparently the Mandylion, which was something that was folded up, and they brought it back, and it became the main cult object for them. It was a grail, what I call a grail object. We didn't really know what face was on this little part of the cloth until the 19th century, when photography was invented, and somebody saw the negative image, a fellow named Pio, and then we could see what was really there. And that is the true image, probably, of the face of Jesus. And that's something that all scholars should be very skeptical of. Every single so-called relic in the world, finger bones of St. Peter, I told you, could reach from here to Watsonville if they took them all out and all that. But this is the one relic that people that really investigate it, and real scholars and scientists and things, think is very, very real. This is an image of the face of the Master. And then there was noble knighthood. Their Grail object, and this became the property of the Teutonic Knights, was the Spear of Longinus. We still have this. It's the relics of it in the Austrian Museum. It was carried by Constantine in all of his battles, and then it was carried by Charlemagne in his battles, because it was the spear that pierced the heart of Jesus, and it was it was supposed to be the real one. Well, who knows? Constantine's wife and the wife of other emperors searched for relics of Christianity, and supposedly this was a true relic. And of course, she supposedly found relics of the true cross, I think you could fill up a couple of pickup trucks full of all the relics she found of the true cross. But anyway,
It's the spear, or what? It's actually like a spear head.
it's a spearhead, and it's got windings around it to preserve it. But it was what was considered, whether it was or wasn't, it was considered by Constantine to be the spear that pierced the heart of Jesus. It was considered by Charlemagne, and so they carried it into battle. Just like Moses put his hands up and his hands down to make them win the battle. So whether it was or wasn't is not so much the issue. As far as everybody's concerned, it was, including Adolf Hitler.
Right.
So it was later carried by most of the Teutonic knight commanders in their battles to make them successful. That was figured, well, if it pierced the heart of Jesus, it was pretty powerful stuff, you know. And so it's kind of a black magical talisman thing, that Jesus is on your side, the blood of Jesus. And it was, yeah.
It's interesting, it has some Arthurian elements to it too, you know.
Arthurian?
Yeah, King Arthur, you know, he has the scabbard, what is it called?
Oh, you mean the sword?
Yeah, the
Yeah.
sword that he can't die if he
Yeah,
carries it,
yeah.
and it's, I don't know.
That's a magical thing. Hitler, this had been held in the Austro-Prussian and Austrian Museum for a long time, and Hitler wanted it because he wanted to carry it because he felt it would give him the power to conquer the world. And he had actually had a replica of it built, and a replica of a museum to hold all the pictures of all the great Teutonic knight leaders and all this kind of stuff, and his generals, Goebbels and all these other people, had special rooms that related them to the Teutonic knights and all this sort of thing. And so he captured this when he finally walked into Austria and just took it over in a bloodless revolution. He walked it off with this and put it in his own place and kept it. Now, in the bombing of Berlin, after Hitler committed suicide, before he committed suicide, he had given it to one of his museum heads to hide it in a certain place and have a phony one, the phony one he'd had made before, put in a place so that when the Allied soldiers came in, they would think they had the real one, but they would have the phony one. But his guy screwed it up and put the real one in the place, in the wrong place, and the phony one in the wrong place. And American soldiers found this thing after they were storming Berlin, and they brought it to who was the general that was in charge of that? General Patton? I'm not sure. But they brought it to the general who was in charge of that, and he knew what it was, because a lot of the people it's against the law for American soldiers to belong to chivalric orders, because it gives them allegiance to things other than the United States government, but a lot of them do anyway. And there are a lot of them in the military, and a lot of them know a lot of these stories, you know, that go with military orders. Well, this guy knew exactly what it was. Well, it was returned after the war eventually to the Austrian government. It's still there. But Hitler used to, as a child, or as a young man, he used to sit in front of it, contemplating it, and he was absolutely fascinated with it and just absolutely devoted to it. It's part of the occult history of the Nazis. So I told you about the recapture and return to the Habsburg treasure house in Vienna, and that's where it is today. These are Carolingian Holy Grail objects. That's a kind of a term that I've created. Walter Stein was the man that Winston Churchill depended upon to help analyze the whole German occult strategy, because Nazism was based on the orders of Thule and the Teutonic Knights and a whole lot of esoteric anti-Semitic orders that existed about German superiority and German knighthood and everything long before the Nazi Party developed. In fact, the Nazi Party probably developed out of this Thule society and some of these other things. And Stein was an expert on this stuff, and he was especially an expert on the period of the Carolingians and the Holy Grail stuff and all that kind of stuff. His stuff was unpublished, and very impossible to get a hold of until very recently. But he was a genius. He had read all the original documents, and he had realized a lot of the legends and the Holy Grail legends were actually about real people who lived. They were true legends. A legend is something that is a sort of a story based on the life of a real person, but it becomes legend later. So, as I say, he was Churchill's advisor for the whole Nazi occultism movement, which was the whole bureaucracy thing. And Hitler lost the war because he used tropical astrology. He used Western astrology to make some very bad decisions that totally disempowered his greatest general, Rommel, and some other people. And he made decisions based on Western astrology. So astrology was part of his strategy and a whole lot of other things like that. If he just had understood Vedic astrology, things would be so much worse today.
Well, Rommel also was involved in a conspiracy to assassinate
Eventually,
Hitler.
because he was such a fool, yeah. He was an absolute fool. A lot of people were involved at the end in conspiracies to get rid of him. But he was an expert on the 9th century and the Holy Grail. And this is a book that now is available that you can get. And I haven't read it, but I know a lot about it. It's a really good book to have. The Arthurian characters and adventures very often are legends that are based on real 9th century Carolingian people, and he tells some fascinating stories. The Graalmeister, the Grail master, Treversant, and the Cave of Initiation were real people that were part of the Druidic Celtic Christian tradition, that were part of this Graal synthesis that existed in the 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th centuries. And the Carolingian and Charlemagne found himself in opposition to their traditions, the traditions that underlay them. And
Yeah, I thought Charlemagne was a devout Catholic.
that's what I say, he was.
So how did all this develop out of him?
It didn't develop out of him. That already existed in native
Right, so this
Celtic
was back
Christianity.
This was back to the Merovingians.
Yeah, there was the Grail Master, and there was the Graal, what was really called the Graal Meister. There were initiators and initiatic traditions, esoteric traditions within Druidic Christianity, and there was actually a real person called Treversant who was a great master at that time. He appears later in the later French Arthurian myths as the uncle of Percival or Parzival. This is one medieval drawing of supposedly of the cave of Treversant. It's the initiatic cave, and he's sitting there looking kind of dead in the middle because he's also supposed to be Christian Rosenkreuz. Because in the Rosicrucian movement, he's associated with Christian Rosenkreuz. This is the mountain of initiation, and this is the vault of Christian Rosenkreuz, which we'll talk about later. That bleeding together of a historical master of these traditions, and then becoming the uncle of Parzival who advises him, and then becoming Christian Rosenkreuz, is the persistence of this tradition that there was this great master we call the Grail Master. And I'm going to tell you now the story of the foreskin relic. One of the very trusted, in fact, the closest, most trusted generals of Charlemagne was a fellow whose name I don't remember. But he had enemies because his alliances were with the Graal tradition and with the Celtic traditions, and he was not a devout Catholic, but he was a very good general. And Alcuin and one of his lower functionaries, I think some kind of a cardinal or priest, who was really opposed to this guy, wanted to get rid of him, was constantly feeding Charlemagne false stories, phony stories about how you couldn't trust this guy. This guy was a bad guy because he was connected with the pagan religions and all this sort of thing. And even though he was one of his closest friends and best and best generals. Finally, he called a court, and these people all testified against him and said yes, that he had relationships with the Graal and with the Graalmeister and the initiation. He was in fact an initiate and blah 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 blah. And so very, very, very regretfully, Charlemagne declared that he should be killed with his head chopped off. So he was held down, and his strongest warrior, strongest guy came up and held his big sword over him, and he couldn't get it to move. He couldn't get the sword to come down on the guy's head. So Charlemagne came and grabbed the sword and tried to do it himself, and he couldn't make it come down. And so he realized that he'd made a big mistake, and he got rid of the other guy. And in order to make amends with this man, he said, "Ask me for anything I have, anything you own. I want to make up for what I've done." So he asked him for the foreskin relic. Now, the foreskin relic, I have to explain to you. In order for the Carolingians, in order for Charlemagne to get the loyalty of the people who were Merovingian, and their tradition was of the Graal traditions and things like this. For him to have their loyalty, they needed to have some kind of the things that they believed in were things like relics of the gods and like things like this sort of thing. And there was a relic. It was supposed to be the foreskin of Jesus, the baby Jesus, when he was circumcised on the 8th day, and it was in a great golden reliquary kept at a certain monastery or something like that. And and it was considered to be one of the most powerful things they possessed, because it was a blood symbol. You know, it was a holy blood symbol, because a foreskin is a very powerful thing. It's got all the aspects of the spear, and it's got the aspects of the blood and the cup and the flesh and everything else. And so that was one of the things that Charlemagne had used to make people realize that they had the blood of the gods, because the Merovingians supposedly had the blood of the gods flowing in them. So his blood of the gods was going to be the Eucharist. It was going to be the blood of Jesus and the Christ, but that didn't make it. People looked into the cup and they didn't see any blood, you know. They looked into the cup and they didn't see any flesh when they saw the little wafers or whatever they were using back then. But boy, when that foreskin came around, they were very impressed. There's the foreskin of the first shaman, you know. So he said that's what he wanted. And so Charlemagne gave it to him, and he said that we're going to find out where does this belong? Where does this need to go? This needs to go in some kind of very special place. So he put it, and this is something like a biblical story about an ass, which I won't go through, but he strapped it to the back of a beast of burden and let the beast just wander. According to the legend, the beast wandered and wandered for miles and miles, and finally came and stopped at this place that was what we today call a nunnery. It was a place of female monks. And it was taken there, it was put there, and it remained there for centuries. It was the foreskin of Jesus, the relic of the foreskin of Jesus in the golden reliquary. But the reason I tell you the story of the foreskin of Jesus is to give you some idea of the flavor of how magic worked and how you gained the alliance of people that were Merovingian, etc. So he had to kind of put his mojo out in front of everybody and all this. Well, that remained within the Carolingian sphere because it was in his lands and all this sort of thing. But that was what he was using. And according to the legend, he gave that to this man, but this man then gave it to the people, type of thing. That's the story of the foreskin. Anyway,
So the foreskin still exists.
I don't know if it still exists. I don't know if it still exists, but it did exist for many centuries, and it's documented and all that sort of thing. Anyways, Walter Stein is an expert on all these things, and was an expert. So here we have an example of Carolingian versus Merovingian holy blood. That's about as far as we get to holy blood, holy grail. So the literary Grail legends, for example, Treverisent or Treverisent or Trevrisent, is the uncle of Parsifal, in one of the who's one of the great Grail knights. He's the greatest. Percival is the greatest of these knights, the purest. A student of Walter Stein before he died was a fellow named Trevor Ravenscroft, and he wrote a book called A Spear of Destiny, and that's still available. You can buy that. If you want to get Stein's research, I think you have to pay $50. That's still pretty expensive. I don't know if it's still really published. But Ravenscroft tells you a lot of these stories about the Spear of Longinus and all this kind of stuff from back in this period, a time of what was going on, and what sort of the realities that sort of underlay the ideas of initiation in the Grail tradition, the quest of the Grail and the Graal, and what that all meant. So these are good things to read if you ever want to. Trouble with Ravenscroft is he'll tell you the story of the Teutonic Knights and Hitler and the Spear and so on, but Ravenscroft did not have the intellect and the education that Stein had, and he had nothing written from Stein. He simply interviewed him for many days before he died and got a lot of this information orally from him. So it's only later after that that Stein's republished. So what do we have as a legacy for Charlemagne? Well, we have Europe, the beginning of the European nations. These sort of parallel lined inland still belong to the Islamic forces, and that's most of Spain and all of northern Africa and Palestine and over here to Armenia. And Constantinople at this time is still free. It hasn't fallen yet, but it will very soon. So this becomes the place where the defender of the faith has liberated as much as possible. So Parsifal is probably the ultimate Holy Grail legend, the spiritual quest allegory. That the Holy Grail is always thought of to be sought in the East. Here's a nice drawing I like of the Holy Grail quest. Here we have people in prayer, but they're knights, and they have swords and things like this. They have on their altar under here, they've found the Grail. It's right there. Boy, there it is. But notice where they are. They're in the east with the Arabs. And that is where the quest really was, because it was in the Arab lands that all the great knowledge was and all the great secrets were to be found. And the Holy Grail legends refer to that and reflect that condition of Europe at that time. So Constantinople finally falls. Muslims captured all the holy relics. Muslims held Jerusalem, and basically all this territory that we're looking at was now Muslim territory. As you can see, that's Jerusalem, Constantinople, way up into what we think of as Asia Minor and going up into Greece and the Grecian Peninsula. Now that is too much. Pope isn't going to go for that. Nobody's going to go for that. And we begin the period of the Crusades. And the search for holy relics to rescue them and get them from Muslims. The Muslims, of course, want to make money, sell them to the Christians. But there's all kinds of trade and theft and fraud and stuff that goes on at this time. So they assumed very great religious and commercial value to get these things. In a later crusade, the Knights Templar sacked Muslim Constantinople, and they captured the Mandylion, which we now know as the Shroud of Turin. This is some artist's conception of the sack of Muslim Constantinople by the Knights Templar. And this became a Grail object to them. So how does it get there? Well, according to the biblical stories, the shroud is picked up and taken and carried by Mary Magdalene. She's the one who finds it and takes it. It goes from there to Asia Minor. And then we know it goes from that main city in Edessa. In Edessa, King Abgar was the first Christian ruler. He was a great devotee of Jesus, although Jesus was still dead, considered to be a theos aner, a divine man, the greatest of all prophets. And when it was in possession of King Abgar at Edessa, it was probably it gets mixed up with what is called with a relic that's associated with Saint Veronica, which is supposed to be a handkerchief that took a miraculous impression of the face of Jesus. But that legend comes much later, and it's probably based on the Mandylion. Anyway, it goes from there to Constantinople during the period of Constantine, and all the great relics go there. The Mandylion relic is then folded into eighths, and this shows you how it's done. The person who discovered this is an English researcher who's written quite a bit about it, and his ideas and his translation of the Greek that helps us to understand this, etc., have been well verified since. So here's how the shroud was over the body of Jesus. You can see the imprint of the whole body on one side, the imprint of the front, the imprint of the back. Well, then that was folded into 8 sections, leaving just the face as part of that. And that's what we ended up with, and that's how the Mandylion was exhibited in Constantinople. And that became the basis for so much of the iconography of the East, was this very smudgy little face on the front of this shroud. That led to the legend of the image in the Veil of Veronica, which is supposedly the king of Edessa had requested a meeting with Jesus, and supposedly he was going to write a letter to him, but he died before he could. However, through a legendary interaction, he had borrowed, or one of his disciples named Veronica had lent him something like a handkerchief that he had washed his face with, or wiped his face with, and it miraculously left an imprint of his face, and so that was taken to King Abgar, and all that sort of stuff. Well, these legends, though, developed very late, so they're not early, but they're probably based on this face that was being exhibited. Here's supposedly the image on the Veil of Veronica. So it seems that the Mandylion and the Veil of Veronica are really two ways of talking about the same thing. But this smudgy face image we looked at is the basis for an awful lot of Eastern Orthodox iconography. And that's how the people studied and meditated before this face, because they felt it was definitely the real historical face of Jesus. And then they came up with their images of the face of Jesus. Well, it falls into the possession of the Knights Templar at the sack of Constantinople, and it becomes the basis for their worship. Now, their Christianity is a theosophical Christianity that's way different than Catholic Christianity. It has all these other images. We might call it a Grail Christianity or a Graal Christianity. And it is their most sacred object, and they do not give it away to anybody. However, after the Friday the 13th and after the persecution of the Templars, their wives were left, along with Jacques de Molay, the person burned at the stake, was his second in command. And his second in command was the person who his wife had in her possession the shroud. She had to sell it in order to support her family. She sold it to the Turin family. This is all history. In Italy as a relic. And she was able to support her family, and that's where it's been ever since. In the Turin, it's called the Shroud of Turin. So this is probably the condition of the wives of the Knights Templar was very bad, and because the reason Philip the Fair had set all these things in motion to get them to be victimized by the Inquisition was in order to gain their wealth. And so these women had to take whatever they had left, personal things, and sell them just in order to make it. And their husbands had to leave quick. They were either tortured for a couple of years before they were killed, or they got out, and they went to Scotland, they went to Portugal. And this is what we have ended up with as a result of this, is we actually have an image of the face of the Master Yeshua. So the Holy Grail starts out as the San Grail. It starts out as the initiatic path. It's like the Lam Rim. It's a successively more advanced kinds of knowledge that you go on, just like you would among the Egyptians or among the Hermetics or among the Tibetans or anyone else. There's a synthesis of all these things, druidic, shamanic modalities, geomancy, divination, and all these other kinds of things. All these are synthesized in this body of initiatic knowledge, so that later on, someone like Nostradamus will know from his Jewish ancestry, he will know Jewish Kabbalah, not Christian Kabbalah. He will know from the basis of his own neighborhood in his own Grail area, because it's in France. He will know divination, how to do scrying with objects. He'll know how to use astrology, and he'll know how. And when he does his divination to do his prophecies, he uses all of these things. He uses the whole Grail stuff, all the knowledge. When we get to Nostradamus, we'll talk about that. So the San Grail starts out as this way that is integrated into Druidic and Celtic initiatic tradition. All the things that come from Greco-Roman and come from Christian and come through other means. It's associated with the Merovingian culture. And there is a legendary Grail master, or Graal master, Treversant, that we hear about, and that becomes very important later on in the Rosicrucian histories and so on. Now we have the Christian Sang Real. This means the royal blood. That's the Eucharist, the magical and salvific holy blood of Christ, which did not much impress the Celtic Christians, because they didn't see anything there except wine and stuff. So we have a synthesis of Catholic and traditional legend for the Christian Sang Grail and the chalice of the Last Supper. And that's established through the Carolingian Catholic Reform, and that lays the basis for the Holy Grail myths. The idea that the Grail is a chalice, it's a cup, it's the cup of the Last Supper. And it's associated a lot with secular knighthood, and it's a spiritual tradition, but it's not a Catholic tradition. The Holy Grail legends are not Catholic traditions. And it becomes the basis for the Arthurian and Troubadour cycles. And then there is an incorporation into Christianity of these San Grail legends that go into the Arthurian legends. The cauldron becomes the cup of the Last Supper, and that equals the Eucharistic chalice. And so now we have this idea of what the literary Holy Grail is. It has nothing to do with the heretical, paganistic, initiatic paths, and that's how it all got there. So this segment was to show you how the San Grail progressed. And it became, in Christian tradition, a life quest for Catholic idea of purity. That would be ascetic, and that would be a knighthood as a good Catholic knight, a good Catholic priest, and this sort of thing. And that's where that Christian Sang Grail tradition of the Holy Grail comes from.